Hi everyone, welcome to the fifth lecture of the course, Rethinking Gender, War and Peace in the 21st Century. I will briefly introduce myself and then move on to the lecture. I'm a lecturer and gender researcher at the Institute of Gender Studies at Tbilisi State University, and my research interests are related to the gendered experiences of war, prolonged displacement, and post-conflict settings. This lecture is organized in two parts, in two interrelated themes. In the beginning, I will elaborate more broadly on feminist perspectives on war, as well as gendered experiences of forced displacement as a result of armed conflicts. And in the remaining part, I will focus on the local case of internal displacement and elaborate on women's experiences of prolonged forced displacement in the Georgian context. I will draw on the feminist scholars, mainly from the field of international relations and gender. And I will start by focusing on the area of studies that explores the gender and feminist analysis of war and armed conflicts. As Carol Kohn puts it, when researching the gendered aspects of armed conflict, it's not enough to simply describe the diversity of women's experiences. This might be the first step, but to understand the complexity and specificity of women's experiences and actions during the war, we must first understand the context of the war, which includes the gender systems in which women live, specificities of the war, broader local and global actors, economic, political, and social processes that shape women's lives in the societies where women lived before, during, and after the war. In order to explore the gender dimension of armed conflicts, a debate about the transformation of wars is essential, which in turn is directly related to the gendered experiences of wars. In the research on the relationship between war and gender, feminist scholars have challenged the dominant perception of armed conflicts. They have emphasized that the dominant view of war as a violent event that has been perceived as an isolated event and described as an inherently masculine space in which only men participate has been dominant, and it has been challenged by the feminist scholars focusing on the relationship between the war and gender. Researchers in this field have emphasized that the vast number of victims in armed conflicts since the end of the Second World War are civilians. The war affects not only the military personnel, but also more and more civilians in different ways. At the same time, the characteristics of the war are fundamentally changing. The combat operations, the nature of the war, the methods are different. The social and political economic infrastructure, including education, healthcare, and transport systems, is being deliberately and strategically destroyed. And as a result of the recent armed conflicts, there have been the cases of mass forced displacement. The cases of the sexual violence, rape are prevalent in these conflicts. War often deliberately destroys the social fabric of the everyday, and post-war conflict resolution is also protracted in time. Moreover, this kind of the state of emergency, which is extended in case of the protracted forced displacement, creates the gender-specific experiences for the displaced population. So the wars no longer take place away from homes of the civilians. Thus, on the one hand, the spatial boundary of the demarcation of war has been erased, and on the other hand, the dichotomy of the combatant and civilian does not make sense any longer when discussing the effects of the war. The prevailing idea about wars no longer corresponds to the actual experiences of wars. Interesting conceptualization of the war in her analysis is proposed by Christine Sylvester, a scholar in political science and women's studies. She broadens the definitions of war as well as of the experiences of war in her book, War as Experience. Sylvester conceptualizes the war as a social institution and politics of injury. She challenges the traditional theories of war in the international relations and explores the multiple complex ways in which war is experienced. Instead of treating the generalized violence of war only as a mere fact, she encourages us to attempt to understand the nature of war itself. As she puts it, war is the politics of injury. And I will read one small part from this book. Everything about the war aims to injure people or their social surroundings as a way of resolving disagreement. In some cases, encouraging disagreement if it is profitable to do so. As part of that mission, many will endeavor to protect themselves from injuries by fleeing the war zone, donning protective clothing, hiding or looking away from war scenes on televisions. Injury is the content of war, not the consequence of it. End quote. Sylvester goes on to elaborate on the social institution as a matrix of war, with a wide range of constitutive elements and components, such as heroic myths, stories about battles for freedom, and tragic losses, memories of war passed from generation to generation, the workings of Defense Department and militaries, the production of war, accepting or glorifying masculinities. So the war does not only entail the experiences of men, militaries, but understood, as Sylvester puts it, as a matrix of war. It affects a wide variety of individuals. The earlier story of the war is outdated also because this narrative of the war excludes women or only occasionally mentions them, for example, as victims with children. Women, in the words of Carol Cohn, occupy a peripheral secondary place in the history of wars, seen this way. Contrary to this, the study of wars from a gender perspective should necessarily include women's experiences. Such conceptualization will be more complex, multi-layered than the dominant narrative about the war. So the next question I will be elaborating on is the category of women. For feminist scholars studying the relationship between the war and gender, it's important to emphasize that women represent a multi-dimensional category. They have experienced, the women who have experienced armed conflict do not represent one monolithic group, as women differ according to their age, economic class, race, so on, and geographic locations. And in the case of women who have experienced war, there is one additional dimension added to these categories, the list of categories, whether they belong and represent the side of the conflict that has won or lost the war. In other words, losers or the winners of the war. These dimensions determine women's connections and relations with armed conflicts. Although not only these factors determine this relationship, but also, as mentioned earlier, the specifics of the war. Representing women only as passive participants or victims of the war has also been challenged by feminist scholars. Cynthia Enlope points out that women in relation to wars are almost always mentioned together with children as women and children, and this indeed is one of the realities. But This experience cannot be generalized, as women play different roles in different conflicts or post-conflict settings. They mobilize for peace in their community. Sometimes they appear in the role of combatants in wars, contrary to the traditional gender norms. Thus, the feminist scholars have emphasized that it's necessary to avoid the generalizations about the war and women and the war and gender, which do not reflect the real picture of war and post-war realities for women. Particular analysis has been paid to the analysis of men and masculinities as well. Cynthia Cockburn, in one of her essays, talks about how feminism challenges the patriarchal gender order, as well as other systems and ideologies such as nationalism and militarism, and the practices associated with them. Cockburn states that the inequalities in patriarchal society are also characteristic of those social systems that we call militaristic and nationalistic social systems. She elaborates on how these three ideologies, militarism, patriarchy, and nationalism, are intertwined. In her work, Why and Which Feminist Anti-Militarist. And I will move on to the next question. And on the relationship between the gender and militarization, and also the normalization of violence. In her study of processes of militarization, Cynthia Enloe describes the processes by which the lives of peaceful citizens, civilian life, are shaped by the practices, institutions, and values associated with militarism. Feminists draw attention to the connection between the militarized violence and peacetime violence, when, for example, Cockburn conceptualizes the continuum of violence committed in the peacetime. Cockburn points out that the continuum of violence that begins long before the violence was an armed conflict and continues long after it ends. According to her, since violence is part of our everyday life and is a gender-specific phenomenon, violence is thus normalized. Thus, the relationship between war and peacetime gender-based violence is consistent and represents a spatial continuum. Violence that occurs in homes, on the streets, in wars, returns to everyday life on an increased scale. And I will read one short quote from this article on the concept of the continuum of violence by Cynthia Cockburn. I have observed the connectedness between kinds and occasions of violence. One seems to flow into the next as if they were a continuum. In emphasizing cultures and therefore continuity between relations and events, a gender analysis suggests that it is meaningless to make a sharp distinction between peace and war, pre-war and post-war. I have separated for convenience phases I call pre-conflict, conflict, peacekeeping, and reconstruction, but we saw gendered phenomena persisting from one to the next. Gender is manifest in the violence that flows through all of them and in the peace processes that may be present at all moments too. End quote. So often when the social fabric of society and community is broken after the war, during the so-called peace, the cases of sexual violence against women and girls increase even more. For feminists, when they emphasize the absence of fine demarcation lines between war and peace, it does not mean that they in any way minimize the brutal forms of violence that accompany armed conflicts. Contrary to this, they believe it is necessary to acknowledge the real experiences of women. For example, it's essential to understand what are the different meanings attributed to the same violent act in the private domestic sphere, family relationships, and in the public sphere, when it is a normalized event and often inevitable in armed conflicts. So it's essential to carefully observe and not disregard different effects of the same violent action. Feminist researchers believe that the widespread and familiar binary representations it creates a vague idea of a more complex reality. Therefore, a feminist gender analysis of war problematizes the concepts such as post-war, post-conflict context. In addition, feminist analysis of war examines the processes and institutions that produce war and gender itself. It examines the relationships between them, how war and gender are intimately intertwined. In the remaining part of my lecture, I will elaborate and now move to elaborating on the aftermath of post-conflict settings, on the experiences of forced displacement, and I will also elaborate on experiences of women during the prolonged displacement in the local context. In the context of the destructive effects of war and communities, either in regard to the experience of wartime or post-war reconstruction, it's sometimes hard to reflect on aspects such as agency or empowerment of women in the post-conflict context. In this sense, some researchers ask the following questions. Does the post-war context create certain new opportunities for women? Is it possible to envisage the new reality of women who have survived the wars? How can we reflect on these aspects in parallel to the pain, trauma, and loss they have endured? The authors single out that the importance of women's survival strategies that have kept families alive and communities together, which is an overlooked subject. It's also important to note that there is no one aftermath, because the scenarios following the war are as various as the conflicts themselves. In the process of social reconstruction of the war-torn societies, so that the transition to peace is successful, the war-torn societies must create the necessary resources. Otherwise, they will be dependent on the international humanitarian aid. The role of women in the process of post-war recovery and reconstruction is of great importance, and studies have highlighted women's ability to adapt to new roles in post-war settings, which is true for our local context as well. In the IDP community displaced within the country in Georgia as a result of the armed conflict starting from the 90s, early 90s, the displaced women showed incredible resilience, resorting to various tactics and strategies to support their families. To introduce briefly the context of the post-conflict context, I will elaborate on the circumstances after the conflict. There have been several waves of forced displacements in Georgia since gaining its independence in 1991. As a result of armed conflict at the beginning of the 90s, thousands of ethnic Georgians were forced to leave their homes in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. started rebuilding their lives from the scratch in their new temporary homes in different locations of the country. Armed conflicts have cost thousands of lives, and many families on both sides of the conflict lost their loved ones to the war. Thousands of combatants as well as civilians were killed, wounded, or went missing during the war. Looting, torture were also documented, both sides. Overall, internally displaced persons represent about 6% of the entire population in Georgia. Ethnically Georgian IDPs are not allowed to return to their homes except to the lower and upper Gali districts, where de facto authorities have allowed some returns, but those who have returned are subject to precarious situations, such as intimidation and threats resulting from ethnic tensions in the region. About 45% of the displaced population has been provided with some kind of accommodation through different programs initiated by the government. The remaining 55% of displaced households have been caught up in the processes of continuous waiting since the early 90s and continue to live in harsh living conditions of collective census. Different studies have shown that after almost 3 decades of forced displacement, the internal displaced population remains more disadvantaged and vulnerable to poverty as compared to the general population in Georgia. In the circumstances of prolonged displacement, the conflict itself ends or has prospects of doing so, but what is unclear for forcefully uprooted persons is when the aftermath ends. In such situations, IDPs feel caught up between their lost homes, present temporary homes, and imagined future homes. Living in open-endedness of prolonged displacement has become a chronic condition for most displaced persons in Georgia. It can be characterized as an experience of continuous uncertainty. After the flight, IDPs start from a position of loss, starting life from scratch under previously unimaginable circumstances in an extremely complex and difficult processes. One of the key tasks is to reveal what is masked and concealed in the aftermath of the conflict behind relatively stable and normal times. In this regard, I'm particularly interested in ways IDPs coped, and some of them are still coping with extremities of dramatic change and their outcomes after the war in their situation of the prolonged aftermath. In my research on IDP women on experiences of prolonged displacement, I am more interested in not just the questions of agency or resilience in post-conflict contexts, but rather in a more nuanced and complex understandings of what it is the cost of such resilience within the context of prolonged aftermath of a violent conflict, which, following Hendrik V, can be conceptualized as a chronic crisis or crisis as a context. Women in this study do not belong to a single and undifferentiated group. They have different connections to the war and different wartime experiences, the circumstances in which they had to flee, unavailability of resources to leave when their safety was threatened by the overall duration of the war. For example, some were caught in the midst of crossfire, others, leaving their husbands behind, had to hide or flee with their small children in search of a safer place, while some of these women escaped relatively unscathed and had access to more resources than others. So some key questions I ask the following. How is this crisis of prolonged displacement faced? Through which strategies, what everyday strategies help displaced women regain the sense of normality? How does the memory and the experience of a violent event become the part of the ordinary? For some of them, the crisis of prolonged displacement, starting from the beginning of 90s, is related to the socioeconomic status of an IDP, as well as the lack of proper accommodation, lack of proper conditions, and financial insecurity. At the same time, I'm theoretically interested in the question of women's agency in post-conflict reconstruction, whether this is related to the ability or the possibility to act under the crisis as a context. IDPs and agency, and if we also elaborate on the ability to act, when we conceptualized agency as the ability of individuals to change the reality they live on, the context of exercising agency is important to what extent one can exercise the agency. When exploring marginalized and vulnerable communities and their agency, the notions of autonomy, freedom, and ability to make an individual choice are closely associated with the term, although some feminist scholars offer an alternative conceptualization of agency while focusing more on aspects such as interrelations, interdependence. The question then is to what extent IDPs could exercise agency and what was the scope of navigation through previously unimaginable circumstances, insofar as individuals did not choose the social environment within which they attempt to regain the sense of normality. They had to develop techniques not just to survive, but to thrive the almost non-existent circumstances. So how is then crisis normalized and what leads to the tentative ordering of the disorder? In case of IDPs from 90s, conflict in Georgia, it has been a dynamic process, changing in intensity, the scale of uncertainty, unpredictability, powerlessness, extreme vulnerability, the feeling of losing control over life has gradually, for some part of them, faded away due to slowly regaining the sense of normality. This process, which also meant not giving up, or if I borrow the concept of sociology, Sarah Brake, bouncing back, being resilient and resistant to external forces immobilizing at times, this process has been vital for surviving and thriving in the first years after the war and displacement. At the same time, what hasn't faded away is aspects related to the objective forces of environment and social reality, the loss of a family member, for example, the loss of property, the loss of homeland, inability to return home, the prolonged and unresolved nature of the conflict, and also the memories of the nostalgia to the past. Therefore, the temporal dimension of prolonged displacement in terms of gradation of how it is experienced is also significant. On the one hand, it helps us view its transformative nature when the subjects exercise agency under unimaginable circumstances, as opposed to passivity or inactivity waiting for new horizons to reappear. It's not just waiting for return, but acting while waiting. But we cannot disregard that on the one hand, there is the experience of vulnerability due to the social realities that cannot be changed due to the impossibility to change. And to conclude, In the experiences of recollections of war and reflections on the post-displacement lives, it's true that IDPs, or internally displaced persons, stories reveal their extraordinary strengths and human hardiness in the form of everyday resilience and through the descent into the ordinary that allowed them to deal with traumatic memories and rudimentary living conditions. Though it's not to suggest that being busy with mundane tasks and ever increasing responsibilities made it possible to overcome and be healed from the trauma of the war and all the consequences that forced displacement entails. At the same time, their stories were filled with pain and vulnerability. Women experiencing extreme emotional damage, loss, and trauma have not only survived but striven to develop the talent for life, borrow the concept of anthropologist Nancy Shepherd Hugh, and through this very descent into the previously unimaginable conditions, through increased everyday responsibilities as caretakers, as sole breadwinners in their households. After human and material losses, they have manifested incredible strength, resilience, and variety in the tactics of getting what they needed. But following other orders, I also believe that we need to consider ways in which to approach the lives of thousands of individuals living and striving in war-torn societies. When conceptualizing the tactics of survival in post-war settings, especially when we insist on portraying displaced women and refugees as unbelievably resilient and strong, insistence on their resilience in times of chronic crisis of prolonged displacement should not be ignore their vulnerability, which would mean negating the severe circumstances in which the lives of socially disadvantaged groups become livable. Instead, as proposed by Shepherd Hugh, on the one hand, we should not underestimate the human capacity not only to survive, but to thrive during and following crisis and extreme adversity. We need to consider the ways in which individuals can be both resilient and frail, and acknowledge the human vulnerability in this very manifestation of extraordinary human hardiness.